Welcome, Virgo. Uh, mm, Two voices in two separate rooms, both saying your name. Something is traveling through the air about you tonight. Not a rumor, not gossip. Something considerably more weighted than that, the specific, unhurried movement of a reputation that has been building in the minds of people who have been paying closer attention to you than you were aware of. Words being exchanged, assessments being made, comparisons being drawn between what exists in the world and what you represent, and finding in that comparison something that most people simply do not find when they go looking. Stay here. This one is going to ask you to look at yourself through eyes that are not your own. And that is almost always uncomfortable and almost always necessary. Mm. There is a specific kind of conversation that happens about certain people not in their presence, not for their benefit, not with any intention of reaching them. A private conversation, the kind that happens between two people who have both encountered the same presence, the same quality, the same specific and irreplaceable something, and who find themselves independently and then together trying to locate the language for what they experienced, not to diminish it, not to analyze it into something manageable, simply to acknowledge it to another person who understands, because they felt it too, that something about their encounter with you left a mark that ordinary encounters don't leave, a residue of impression, a quality of memory that is more vivid, more specific, more stubbornly present than the memory of most experiences tends to be. Two men today in 2026, in two separate moments, or perhaps in a shared one, saying your name with a quality of attention that names don't usually receive, not casually, not in passing, with the specific weight of people who have been thinking about something and have finally, in the presence of each other, found the occasion to say it out loud. Let me tell you what it means when your name is spoken that way, with weight rather than lightness, with specificity rather than casualness, with the particular tone of voice that a person uses when they are referring to something that has genuinely mattered to them. It means that something about your presence, not your performance, not the version of you that was visible and curated and presented with deliberate intention, but something more fundamental than that has remained, has settled into the memory of someone who encountered it and has refused, with the particular stubbornness of things that are real, to become ordinary in the remembering. This reflection invites you to consider what quality in you, not what you do, not what you offer strategically, but what you simply are in the unremarkable and unguarded moments of being yourself, do you suspect has been leaving that kind of mark on the people who have been paying close enough attention to notice it? Because there is always something specific in the people who are remembered the way you are apparently being remembered. A quality of presence that doesn't perform itself, that doesn't require an audience to exist, that simply radiates without effort or intention from the particular construction of who you are, from the specific combination of how you think, how you listen, how you occupy space, how you make people feel in your proximity without ever having specifically tried to make them feel anything. That quality is not manufactured. It cannot be manufactured. It is simply what happens when a person is sufficiently, honestly, completely themselves, and the people around them feel the difference between that and the managed, curated, performance oriented version of presence that most people offer most of the time. Two men talked about you today, and I want to be honest about what I can and cannot tell you about that conversation, because honesty in a space like this one is the only currency that actually serves you. I cannot tell you their words with certainty. I cannot tell you their intentions or their feelings or the specific direction their thoughts about you are moving. What I can tell you is this: when someone is the subject of a conversation between two people who both know them, the quality of that conversation is almost always a direct reflection of the quality of the impression they left. And the impression that has generated a conversation worth having today in 2026, in the specific moment that this reading is addressing, is not the impression of someone forgettable. Uh, it is instead the impression of someone who has a specific and unusual quality of presence that the people around them are still apparently processing, still turning over, still finding new dimensions in the way that only genuinely complex, genuinely interesting, genuinely irreplaceable things continue to reveal new dimensions the longer they are examined. This reflection invites you to consider: what is your relationship with the knowledge that you are being thought about, discussed, assessed? And does that knowledge activate in you something closer to confidence or something closer to the specific discomfort of a person who has never entirely trusted that the impression they leave is as positive as the external evidence occasionally suggests? Because for many people, the news of being talked about, even positively, even with admiration, even in terms that would, if heard directly, produce genuine validation, activates something uncomfortable rather than something comfortable. The particular vulnerability of being seen without being present to manage the seeing. The specific unease of knowing that your name is in someone else's mouth and that you have no control over the context it is being placed in, the tone with which it is being spoken, or the conclusions being drawn from the evidence of your existence that the speaking of your name implies. That vulnerability is real, and it is, in its own way, the price of being someone whose presence is memorable enough to generate conversation in their absence. Some of you watching this have a complicated relationship with being noticed, have learned through specific and credible experience that visibility is not always safe, that being seen can precede being judged, being diminished, being reduced to the most convenient and manageable version of yourself by people who found the full version inconvenient to accommodate, and that learning, however understandable, however rooted in experiences that were entirely real, has produced a habit of smallness, of moving through the world at a volume slightly below what you are actually capable of occupying space with a kind of apologetic precision, as though the fullness of your presence requires justification before it is allowed to exist without qualification. The conversation happening about you today in 2026, in whatever room it is happening in, between whatever two voices are saying your name with that specific quality of weight, is not the conversation of people responding to smallness. It is the conversation of people responding to what breaks through the smallness, what insists on being noticed, even when it is not trying to be. What makes an impression, not because it was performing for an impression, but because it was simply completely, unapologetically itself, and that in a world saturated with performance, is remarkable enough to generate conversation on its own. This reflection invites you to consider, what would it mean for you, in the most practical and immediate sense, to occupy the full volume of who you are without the apologetic precision, without the reflexive smallness, without the habit of existing at a level slightly beneath what you are actually capable of, and what do you suspect would become possible if you did? Let me talk about the specific quality of male attention because this reading addresses it directly and it deserves to be addressed with some nuance. When men talk about a woman, and I am speaking specifically and carefully here, not generally in the way that this reading is suggesting, it is rarely simple. It is rarely uncomplicated. It contains almost always a mixture of things, admiration, and something that resembles its cousin but isn't quite the same, respect, and something that sits just adjacent to it, the specific and not entirely comfortable recognition of encountering someone whose presence does not fit the categories that have been, until now, sufficient for organizing their understanding of what a person can be. You don't fit the available categories. That is perhaps the most accurate way to describe what is generating this conversation. Not because you are performing, the refusal to fit performance of that kind is visible, and what is visible becomes manageable. But because the specific construction of who you are, the combination of qualities, the particular mixture of strength and softness, precision and depth, clarity and complexity doesn't resolve into something simple, doesn't allow itself to be filed away under a convenient label and no longer actively thought about, remains instead present in the minds of the people who have encountered it, active, unresolved, generating apparently conversation. This reflection invites you to consider, what is the most honest thing you know about the quality that makes you difficult to categorize, the thing about you that doesn't resolve into something simple for the people who encounter it? And have you ever fully allowed yourself to understand that this quality is not a complication, but your most significant asset? Uh, because the world, in its preference for the manageable, tends to communicate to people who don't fit its categories that the not fitting is a problem requiring correction, that the complexity is excessive, that the depth is inconvenient, that the specific, irreducible, entirely non negotiable quality of being fully, honestly, completely yourself is something that needs to be trimmed into something more accommodating before it will be acceptable. And some of you have absorbed that communication so thoroughly over so many years that you have become quietly, incrementally, with the best of intentions toward everyone around you, significantly smaller than you actually are, significantly more manageable, significantly less of the specific, memorable, conversation generating presence that two men are apparently discussing today. The conversation is happening without your management, without your editing, without the familiar apparatus of self presentation that you deploy, often unconsciously, to make your presence more palatable, more contained, more suitable for the comfort level of the environments you move through. It is happening in response to the version of you that leaked through the management, the version that insisted on existing even when you were trying to be smaller, the version that left the impression that is now, today, generating words between two people who both encountered it and found themselves, apparently, unable to simply move on from the encounter without giving it language. That version, the unmanaged one, the one that exists when the performance rests and something truer takes its place, is the one worth being fully, without apology, without the exhausting, ongoing project of making yourself small enough to fit into spaces that were never built for what you actually carry. The power is yours. It always has been. Not the power to control what is being said about you in rooms you are not present in, by people whose thoughts about you are their own business and not yours to manage. But the power to decide deliberately, consciously, as an act of genuine self respect, to be the version of yourself that generates those conversations, rather than the smaller version that tries with considerable effort and at considerable cost to avoid being noticed enough to generate anything at all. Today, two men talked about you. In 2026, look at what they said, not the specific words, which I cannot give you, but the quality of the saying, the weight of it, the specificity of it, the fact that your name in their mouths carried something that names don't usually carry. Not eventually already happening, already in motion, already demonstrating in the most concrete and undeniable way available, that the impression you leave on the world is considerably more significant than the impression you have been allowing yourself to make. Trust yourself with this. The conversation happening about you today is not about the managed version. It is about the real one. And the real one, the full, unedited, completely inhabitable version of who you actually are, is not something that needs to be justified or qualified or made smaller before it is allowed to exist in the world at full volume. Before you go, I want to hear from you in the comments. What do you think they said? And I mean that genuinely, not as a rhetorical question. If two people who know you were talking about you today, what quality in you do you suspect came up? And how does it feel to consider that that quality has been making an impression you weren't entirely aware of? And what is the one thing about yourself that you have been most consistently making smaller? And what would change if you stopped? Drop it below. I read every single word, and nothing shared here goes unacknowledged or unwitnessed. See you in the next one, and listen. Two people said your name today with weight, with specificity, with the particular quality of people who have been thinking about something real. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything a confirmation, arriving from the outside, of something that the truest part of you has always already known. Take care.